Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 3. And yet this experiment has been an utter failure. If you look at it from the right perspective, you might call it a success, Appius. Pepper stayed over that night. Not that Tony needed her to. However exhausted he was perfectly happy to get up every time Jamie let out so much as a whimper from his small portable cot. It was difficult enough to go to sleep in the first place. Damn near impossible to put Jamie down without tracing his fine chubby features or stroking his dark downy hair one last time. Who the hell knew that the warm weight and powdery smell of baby could be as addictive as any legal or illegal substance Tony had ever put inside his body? By 6 a.m, after the third nighttime excursion to feed or change the baby, Tony was too hopped up on the whole situation to even contemplate going back to sleep.
"Hey, Jarvis," he said, walking into the living room with Jamie in the crook of his good arm. Jamie seemed as wide awake as Tony felt, blowing spit bubbles and trying to grab at Tony's beard. "Yeah, you don't feel like sleeping either, do you, little guy?" Jamie replied with nonsensical babbling and the world's most gorgeous little toothless smile. "Yeah, I know," Tony agreed. "Jarvis, can we get some baby books? Can we... Hey, do we know how old he is?" "Certainly, sir," Jarvis says. "I'll look through the reviews and find a selection of the highest rated ones, shall I? And young Master James is approximately 3 months old. I estimate he was less than a week old when he arrived." "Wow," Tony said, flashing Jamie a grin that got him a loud, happy noise of flailing arms in return. "You really are little, aren't you?" He shifted his grip on the baby just slightly, ran the fingers of his bad hand gently through Whisper's soft dark hair. Aside from the eyes, he had Tony's coloring, had enough of Tony visible in his features by now that even if Tony had still wanted to deny the relationship, he doubted he'd have been able to. "Thanks, Jarvis. What else do we need that Pepper hasn't already bought?" "I will look through some of the higher-ranked parenting sites and create a list, sir," Jarvis says. "I have already taken the liberty of ordering baby merchandise from some of your favorite musicians. Congratulations, sir." Tony could have sworn that was real near human fondness in his voice. "And may I add that I'm honored the young master and I share a namesake." "No one better to name my boys for," Tony said, feeling a tugging at his lips and a bubbling sort of lightness in his chest, despite the art reactor, that he couldn't remember ever feeling before. "You got any of those books ready yet?" "Preloaded to the tablet on the table in front of you," Jarvis replied. Tony reached out with his bad arm, grabbed the tablet, wincing, and pulled it to him. It took quite a bit of maneuvering to balance baby tablet and busted shoulder, but he finally managed to find a position that was mostly comfortable and allowed him to read and scroll through the books without having to put Jamie back in the cot. That done, he settled in to read. "Happy you dropped these off," Pepper said as she walked into the workshop, dropping a pair of shipping boxes on one of the workbenches. She pulled open one of them, pulled up a handful of baby-sized band and joke shirts. Onesies, Tony was pretty sure they were called. "Tony, honestly," she added, holding up one in particular. "To-do list, crap pants, take nap, suck some titties. Do not turn him into a celebrity kid troublemaker before he's even a year old." Tony held up his hands. "I take no responsibility," he said, even as he bit back a laugh. "Those are all Jarvis. Hey, Jay, didn't know you added in you." Pepper sighed. "I guess he has to show who programmed him every once in a while," she said. "What are you doing?" "Jarvis and I are making a bouncy chair that's way better than any of the shit that's sold commercially," Tony said. "Jarvis, can you show her the blueprints and do the stress tests now that you're at it?" He cast a glance at Jamie in the cot, felt a grin pull on his lips when he realized that bleary gray eyes were looking back at him. "You're awake, little man. Come on, let's go check out your new wardrobe." Quickly, he crossed the few feet separating him from the baby, picked him up, grabbed a random onesie from the pile, and walked upstairs. It took a week before he had no choice but to turn his attention back to the arc reactor. The current model was giving out inconsistent energy, and the bursts were leaving him short of breath for periods, and with more chest pain than he reasonably should have had. At least he now had a top-of-the-line Stark Tech bouncy chair to put Jamie in while he worked, and a holographic mobile to keep him entertained when just looking at Tony wasn't fun enough. Still, it was difficult to focus on something that wasn't Jamie, wasn't getting Jamie's nursery absolutely perfect, wasn't making sure to be right with his son as much as he possibly could, so Jamie would never have to feel the same doubts Tony had as a kid. Ugh, daddy issues much? At least Howard had given him a pretty perfect recipe of what not to do. It took 3 days to make the necessary upgrades and fabricate the Mark II of the arc reactor. Thankfully, Pepper was in the house, so he could get it installed already. "Jarvis, connect to Pepper's tablet, please," he said, turning away from the project for a moment to tickle Jamie's delightfully chubby baby tummy and get a wide gummy grin and babbled laughter in return. "Mrs. Potts is on the line, sir," Jarvis said. "Pepper," Tony said, making a face at Jamie, who squealed again and wiggled his arms and legs madly, setting the chair to bouncing, which only seemed to excite him more. "How big are your hands?" "What?" Pepper returned, sounding completely confused, but why? It was a perfectly logical question. Tony didn't even have that big hands, and he sure as hell wasn't going to be able to change the reactor. He had no idea how Yinsen had managed to install the magnet and everything in the first place. "How big are your hands?" he asked again. "I don't understand my—" And now she just sounded dubious. Oh, perhaps he should actually explain, which was probably easier if they weren't in different rooms. "Get down here," he said, cutting her off. "I need you." He cut the call and pulled off his shirt, picking up the new reactor and putting it in his lap. Jamie, as always, started to reach for the light, babbling excitedly. He probably thought Tony was his own personal nightlight, which, well, actually bothered Tony a lot less than it probably should. Tony plopped into a chair, flashing a grin at the baby, and turned his head to look at Pepper when she walked in. "All right," he said. "Let's see them. Show me your hands." He held up his own hand, wiggling his fingers, which got another squeal out of Jamie. "Let's see them." She held her hands up for inspection. Yeah, that should about do it. "Oh, wow, they are small. Very petite indeed. I just need your help for a sec." "Oh, my God!" Pepper breathed, and something about the tone of her voice, the sympathy, made Tony ache. "Is that the thing that's keeping you alive?" Tony turned the new reactor over in his hand. "It was. It's now an antique." He glanced up at Pepper for a moment before directing his eyes back to the new model. "This one will be keeping me alive for the foreseeable future. I'm swapping it out for an upgraded unit," he continued, looking back up at Pepper. "And I just ran into a little speed bump." Pepper shook her head, eyebrows furrowing. "Speed bump? What does that mean?" "There's nothing," Tony said. "It's just a little snag." Carefully, he clicked the old reactor loose and pulled it free from the casing. "There's an exposed wire under this device, and it's contacting the socket wall and causing a little bit of a short. It's fine." Grimacing a little, he pulled the reactor wiring free and handed Pepper the old model. Off to the side, Jamie had grown tired of the show and was yawning as he looked up at his custom-made holographic mobile, tiny hands reaching tiredly for the shapes and colors. "What do you want me to do?" Pepper stammered, pulling him back to the situation at hand, which, yeah, probably a good idea, since the electromagnet would definitely need some new juice in the very near future, or he'd be forced to finally find out what it actually felt like when all the shrapnel in his chest began to move. "Put that on the table over there," Tony said. "That is irrelevant." Very gently, with far more care than Tony would have shown for an outdated model, Pepper placed the old reactor down on the worktop. "Oh my God!" she breathed, and Tony couldn't quite tell if she was awed or disgusted. He figured he'd go with awed. "I want you to reach in," Tony continued, "and you're just gonna gently lift the wire out." Pepper got ready, and Tony could practically see the way she was steeling herself, hand stretching out, little finger and thumb tucking in to make itself even smaller. She hesitated, looking up at him. "Is it safe?" Tony really thought it would be, but it all kind of got out of control really quickly after that, and Tony really missed the days when he didn't know what cardiac arrest felt like, but hey, the new reactor got installed, and he managed to traumatize at least one employee, and then he was free to take Jamie upstairs, get him fed, and put him into his awesome new crib. With a slight shrug, Tony plopped down on the bed and joined him in sleep. Tony wasn't sure exactly when it was that he began to think about the armored suit again. Actually, no, that wasn't true. It was more accurate to say that he wasn't sure exactly when the nightmares began, but it was probably when he'd been back home for around 3 or 4 weeks. He was beginning to get used to Jamie, to having him around. Not used to in the way Howard had been used to Tony, where it meant he could completely ignore his existence whenever it suited him. Used to in the sense that he no longer needed to spend every spare moment smothering the poor kid, in that the nursery was done, and Tony was starting to feel like every parenting book he'd read was a copy of one of the ones he'd read earlier. In that, he'd found and improved every single age-appropriate toy and equipment and piece of furniture he could think of. In that he was starting to accept that sometimes the best thing he could do for Jamie was put him on a tiny-sized mattress on the floor, on his tummy, thank you parenting books, and let him reach for and interact with one of the holographic programs Tony had created for him. The problem was that not being able to focus as much on his son left Tony's head free to head off in all kinds of different directions. During the days, that was easily enough handled by beginning to code and design the electronics line he believed would help tide the company over until everyone was done squabbling and they could move into clean energy. At night, his mind began to delve back into the cave in Afghanistan, waking up with a car battery hooked to his chest, having his face shoved into barrels of murky water, the overwhelming fear that the battery would get wet, electrocute him, instant dying. He'd wake up heart racing, bathed in cold sweat, trembling and racing on unsure legs to make sure Jamie was safe in his crib, that no one had grabbed him and taken him away. Nothing felt safe. "Jarvis, you up?" he asked one night, curled up on the stereotypical rocking chair he hadn't been able to resist making, Jamie safe against his chest. "For you, sir? Always," Jarvis replied, and okay, that was a bit more sass than Tony remember programming. Oh well. Have we found out anything about Jamie's mother? Tony got up, careful not to jostle Jamie too badly, as he grabbed the new and improved portable cot and a blanket and tucked the baby in. Then he gripped the handles and brought it down to the workshop with him, put it in the corner, and headed over to the computer, began to call up the basic code that he hadn't been able to help himself from noodling for the past few nights. "No, sir," Jarvis said. "There's no match between any national hospital records of any of your identified female lovers that fit the time frame. None of their features match young Master James very well, either. Grey eyes and a cleft chin aren't the most common features." Tony groaned because he did hate that loose end, utterly loathed it. He hated that there was no known person he could seek out, get to sign the parental rights over to him once and for all. Hated the idea that someday some woman could just show up out of the blue and demand Jamie back. Still, he had to accept that there was nothing he could do about that, not at present. Had to accept that if that day ever did come, he had some of the best lawyers in the world in his corner. For right now, though, that was something he couldn't control. When it came to other threats, though, he could sure as fuck make them a lot safer than they were. After all, hadn't he already built a Mark I? Hadn't he, if he was honest, already started advancing it? "I'd like to open a new file, index as Mark II. He pulled open the basic Mark I design he'd been putting into the machine on other sleepless nights, used a pointer to drop it into the holoprojector. "Shall I store this on the Stark Industries Central Database?" Jarvis asked. No. Tony had a strangely bad gut feeling about that. At the moment, his board hated him more than ever, and he wasn't sure where everyone else stood either. He pushed himself out of his chair, watched as the design began to come to holographic life in front of him. "Actually, I don't know who to trust right now." He stuck the pointer in the pocket and rounded the projector. "Till further notice, why don't we just keep everything on my private server?" "Working on a secret project, are we, sir?" Jarvis asked. Damn, there he went with his ass again. If this kept up, Tony was going to have to take a look at his code. Then again, he supposed sass he hadn't programmed kind of went with the whole learning intelligence shtick, so maybe not. He pushed that thought aside, focused on the project in front of him, began to drag the substandard parts off, and drop them into the virtual bin. "I don't want this winding up in the wrong hands." Another piece of the design went as Tony took a closer look. He paused, cast a glance over his shoulder at where Jamie was sleeping peacefully. "Maybe in mine it can actually do some good."